Hello, welcome to White Threads FlossTube number 25. Today I'm going to talk to you about Portuguese whitework, and I'm going to show you how I do an eyelet for the way I would do it in Portuguese whitework, and then also show you how we can adapt the start that we use of that eyelet to being a start that we can use for other embroidery. And it's so useful, so do stay to watch that. So, this is my book, Portuguese Whitework, Bullion Embroidery from Guimarães, and the embroidery that is worked for this style has lots of bullions and lots of eyelets. So I'm going to show you how to work those eyelets today. If you are a French speaker, there is this version of the book, La Broderie Blanche Portugaise, and I probably said that really badly, but anyway, sorry. And that's the same book, but in French. So, this is a piece from my book, Portuguese Whitework, and it is the square mat, and you can see that there are lots of eyelets on here. Now, when I did these eyelets, I did not yet know how to work an eyelet in the middle of nowhere, and so on the back you will see that there are threads leading from those eyelets here to the other stitching nearby. And part the way through, I think, part the way through I thought, there has to be a better way of doing this. You should have to be able to put them in the middle of nowhere. So you can see that by the stage I got to this one here, all of them are sitting in the middle of nowhere, and I'd figured out how to work them so that there was no thread leading to them or away from them. And that's such a useful thing to be able to do for eyelets. Now, I've already shown you how to do this as a counted eyelet, and I will put a link up the top of this video to that video so that you can go and see it in case you haven't. So on to showing you how to do it. So first of all, with my wash out fabric pencil, I draw a small circle onto the fabric, like that. And that's going to be used for the basis of our eyelet. So from the front, I'm going to insert my needle. I'm using a pearl cotton 8 here. And I'm going to be travelling around in an anti-clockwise direction. So I've inserted the needle from the front. There is no knot on the end of the thread. And I'm just going to pull that through so that there's just the merest whisker sitting out there at the end. Then I'm going to go back between the whisker end and the working end, and I'm going to go between them and insert the needle. Now what I want is for on the back for that to have pierced the thread. So I'll just check that it has. So I went down underneath the hoop and checked that it had, and it had. If it hadn't, I could very easily bring my needle out and reposition it so that it does pierce the thread on the back. Then pull that through. Don't pull it hard at this moment because it still would be very easy to come out. And then come out a little bit further around the circle, pull the needle through, and then go back between the previous stitch and the working end of the thread. And again, you want to pierce that thread on the back. So I'm just going to check, and yes, it did pierce the thread on the back. Okay, so now we can pull that, and that is very, very firm. That is not going to come undone. It's also very thin, so if you put your fingers on either side of that, you will find that it's not thick or anything, so it's not going to increase the bulk inside the edge of our eyelet. Now I'm going to change to a running stitch, and I'm going to running stitch around that circle, going over about 2 or 3 threads and under about 1 or a half a thread. Now the reason why that is I want this to be my guide for stitching, and I'd like most of it to be on the top of the fabric, so if I go only under the smallest amount of fabric, most of it will sit on the top. You will note, as usual, I am stitching left-handed here. You could just as easily switch your needle over to your right hand and do this exactly the same as I am doing. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going around until I meet up with the beginning stitch. Now that whisker at the end there has mostly disappeared. If it was a bit longer, then you could just snip it off, but now that's gone all the way through to the back, so it's just fine. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose which hole I'm going to make my center, and I think that looks like a good one, so I'm going to say that that's the center of my eyelet. Now I'll bring my needle out at the edge of the eyelet, and what I want to do is I don't want to come out outside that line. I basically want to come out underneath that line of stitching. So if I angle my needle out from the side and bring it out there, that should work just fine. Now insert the needle in the hole, and we are going to continue around in a clockwise direction here. I will bring my needle out just outside the stitching. If you bring it out bigger, then the whole thing is going to get bigger, and we don't want it to get bigger. After each stitch, I pinch and pull away from the center, and that's what's going to open my eyelet up. Now you will note as I go around that my stitches are not really close to each other. Every time you put a stitch into that center hole, you are filling it up. So what we want is just enough stitches to open that hole out without filling it up. And as I go around, I tend to get about 11 stitches in. So if you think about it, that's nearly one for every hour of the clock. And I mean that in terms of spacing, not in terms of the time it's going to take you. So keep going round, each time coming out basically underneath the previous line of stitching and pinching and pulling away from the center, and that's what's going to open your eyelet up. I see no point in having pinprick eyelets. Eyelets are meant to be holes, so let's make them holes. I am doing this in green here. If it was for Portuguese Whitework, which is the normal application that I would use these for, I would use white thread, not green. I am doing this in a hoop today. When I'm demonstrating for classes, I always do it in a hoop because it makes it easier for people to see. If I'm doing it just for my own stitching, then I would sometimes have it in a hoop and sometimes I wouldn't bother to. Okay, so we get to close to the end, and what we want to do is leave the last, I think it's 2 or 3 stitches sitting up. Let's go for 3. So there's 2 there. Now as you do this each time with the loose ones, just be very careful that you don't snag your sharp end of your needle onto a previous stitch as you go through the center, because if you do, you will never be able to tighten these stitches properly. So that's our 3 big loops sitting up, and whoops, that's tightened a bit much, so I'll just loosen it off a bit. And then put your needle into those 3 loops, sit the needle in it, don't pull it through, and then tighten the thread around the needle. That is where you would not be able to get it tight if you had snagged any of the previous stitches on the needle. Pull it through so you've got the doubled thread, tighten again, pull it through so you have the single thread, tighten again, and then pull it home. And now if I was going to just have that eyelet sitting in the middle of nowhere, I could chop that off now. If for the sake of Portuguese Whitework I was going to go on and immediately stitch my bullions around there, then I would just take it through to the back like that and come out ready to do my next bullion. So this style of embroidery is worked on 38 count linen. That's quite a high count of linen, and it's worked with number 8 pearl cotton. For the drawn thread work parts, I use a number 24 tapestry needle, and for all of the surface work parts I use a straw needle or a milliner's needle, number 4. So you could probably see how small and insignificant that start was that we used underneath the beginning of the eyelet. It's very strong, you can give it a really strong tug and it doesn't go anywhere, which is really useful. It's also very thin and not bulky, so it's very insignificant in its size, and it means that you can put it underneath other things without increasing the bulk or without it showing. So now I'm going to show you how to do that start again and how you could use it under other stitching, and therefore why it is such a useful start to be able to do. Right, okay, so what I've done is I've come in from the front and I'm going to come out just a little way away from there. This time I'm going to stitch it towards me, and I'm just going to leave a little whisker sitting there like that. So you can make it as short as you can, and if you find that every time you do this you just pull it straight through, then you could always put a small knot there and then chop it off later. So I want to insert my needle between the whisker end and the working end of the thread. And before I pull it through, I want to go to the back of my hoop and check that I have pierced that thread, that the needle goes through the thread on the back. Okay, I checked that from below and yes, it does. If it didn't, I could have taken my needle out and moved it so that it did. So I'm going to come, don't pull it too tight at this stage because you could pull that whole thing out reasonably easily. So come out just a little way along, and then between the previous stitch and the working end of the thread, go back in again, and again on the back you want to pierce that thread. So let me just check. And yes, that did pierce it. Now what we have here, that's our finished start, which sounds a bit odd, and that is very non-bulky. It's also extremely firm. I can give that a really strong tug and it's not going anywhere. And so it means you can use it underneath other stitches. So sometimes if I'm doing some, say, satin stitch and I don't have very much places that I could start my thread and I want to start it in just a very small way, then I could stitch this underneath where I know my satin stitching is going to go. I'm just going to trim that end off because it's bothering me. Okay, so we've got rid of my whisker and you can see that that's a very insignificant start, but it's also really strong. So I could put that underneath where my satin stitch is going to go. I can also even stitch a bullion stitch over the top of that now and you wouldn't see it, particularly if you've used white thread. This is green, so it's going to show up a bit more. But it means that you can start very small and strongly with not much showing. I could stitch stem stitch over the top of that. So if you're going to use this, you just need to make sure that you place it underneath where your stitching is going to be. And it's a really great way to start stitching. So I hope you learnt heaps from that. Hopefully you've seen a little bit more of Portuguese whitework. You've learnt how to make an eyelet, a surface stitchery eyelet, in the middle of the fabric in such a way that there is no thread leading from it or away from it. And you've also learned how to use the same start to be under other stitching and why it's so useful for that. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you will come back and join me for next time. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do. And if you found this useful, I'd love it if you would share this video with your friends. Thanks for joining me. Bye.